What I'm pleased to see across international law enforcement is a recognition that things must change. Future developments in crime and the environment in which it operates will, I believe, challenge many of the assumptions on which law enforcement bases its activity against organised crime. These basic assumptions include how organised crime is structured, how the criminals actually conduct their business, and importantly, how they communicate. Tactics that worked for law enforcement in the past will not continue to work for the future. There are already major capability gaps in some of those areas, and they will get worse if they're not corrected. This is becoming clear when we review identity fraud and corporate fraud in the business sector. When you consider corruption in international business, it's easy to realise that all previous points of reference for serious organised crime are moving. Most observers believe that existing international criminal markets in drugs, fraud, the trafficking of human beings and money laundering will all remain significant. The increasing world population and the developing integrated global economy will ensure that. Trafficking will increase as governments increase efforts to protect their borders, providing more opportunities for organised crime. And the principal destination markets for both drugs and trafficked people are likely to remain in the developed world. Now, I believe it's highly unlikely that new types of crime will suddenly emerge, although technology will allow for many new ways to commit crime to appear. But new crime markets may well emerge as a result of the variations between legislation and enforcement in some jurisdictions, new developments in legitimate markets such as biometrics or carbon trading, and as the pressure grows on existing resources of land, food, water and energy. Already we're seeing pressure on law enforcement to deal effectively with issues such as cybercrime. The Secretary-General of Interpol recently spoke about this in Hong Kong, where he identified the fact that we forget all of the connected devices to the internet besides the personal computer that can now be attacked and lead to personal, corporate and state vulnerabilities. Other new markets for crime include emission and pollution trading frauds, illegal waste disposal and dumping, interference with biometric systems and databases, the theft and trafficking of finite resources, fuel, minerals, precious metals, food and water. Huge concern exists over the intellectual property crime relating to non-tangible products. In the event of catastrophic events, short-term criminal market opportunities will arise, such as post-disaster migration, insurance fraud or contracts for reconstruction. Law enforcement will be increasingly pressurised to deal with these issues and at the same time as dealing with the catastrophe itself and security demands from those who feel more and more under threat. The point that I made concerning ostensibly legitimate business people will be revisited, where huge developments in international trade will enable rapid switching of commodities. I believe that we will see more and more clean skins who will operate in both the legitimate and the illegal at the same time, and will integrate both sides of their business to take advantage of logistical and financial systems. This will create major difficulties for law enforcement as it seeks to differentiate for the purposes of narrowly defined criminal legislation between what is legal and illegal business. Serious organised crime is a major threat to our democratic way of life and to the global way of living and business that we need for the future. Developing countries will fail if the serious organised crime that already infects the developed world is allowed to run riot in those countries. Already we see parts of Africa that have been effectively taken over by serious organised crime from South America and Asia. They are invariably countries where the national infrastructure is weak or corrupt or non-existent. What they do have, though, is a long-established position in the chain of trade routes that grew under imperial colonisation and have remained to the present day. Now, these can be infiltrated by serious organised crime to allow them to move their commodities covertly or obtain control over high-value raw material as its availability becomes constrained in the future. Criminals see these countries as their staging posts and operating centres for the future, especially as we become better at preventing their criminal activities closer to home. During the next couple of years, for example, the entire continent of Africa will have a wideband internet service capability that will rival or beat the service in many of the so-called developed countries. Now, whilst this is to be applauded as a vital tool for the development of that continent, the opportunities offered to criminals are massive. For all of these reasons, I believe it's vital that national security strategies include serious organised crime, and that internationally, in cooperation, all countries focus upon the methods to prevent opportunities for criminal activity. This will require the new law enforcement of the 21st century to take another approach to dealing with crime. The focus of most law enforcement has been focused, difficult investigation, leading to arrest and seizure, followed by prosecution and conviction. Occasionally, the odd bit of asset seizure or removal of the proceeds of crime is thrown in, but invariably law enforcement then moves on to the next target, the next case. Investigative competency and the rule of law are essential for the future, but they have to be augmented with new methodologies and approaches if we are to successfully combat serious organised crime and prevent it re-emerging. In my previous role as the Director General of the Serious Organised Crime Agency in the UK, we worked with many countries and their law enforcement agencies throughout the world. As part of my role, I was privileged to visit many of those agencies to cement agreements and arrange memorandum of understanding so that the UK and other countries could work together. Much of that work was essentially diplomatic and representing the UK government's interest as well as that of SOCA. In most of those countries, however, I saw professional law enforcement of a very high order. The quality of the work, the calibre and courage of the young men and women engaged in this work was and remains truly outstanding. The criminal justice machine also has prosecutors working hard with an ever-increasing burden of legislative requirements with which to comply, and prisons are ultimately full of guilty individuals serving long periods of incarceration. Unfortunately, there are also too many countries where law enforcement is out of date, out of touch, or simply incompetent or corrupt. That is changing, and we must all continue to work together to aid, but in some cases force those countries to come up to the mark. Unfortunately, and this will disappoint many of you and probably have me expelled from the country as persona non grata, the best law enforcement methods in the world are not making the level of difference that we need to make, and will find it harder still when serious organised crime moves on into those new markets that I've already spoken about. During this conference, we will have the benefit of an impressive range of speakers delivering what I believe to be a powerful strategic overview of serious organised crime as it presently is understood. Much of the focus will also cover the way that law enforcement has developed enormously in its capability and competencies. That's all well and good, and we should all take justifiable pride in that development. But it's my strongly held conviction that unless and until national governments become properly involved and take a global approach to serious organised crime and follow the United Nations Convention protocols that were agreed in 2004 to deal with serious organised crime as part of the threat to national and international security, Kofi Annan's foreword to the UN Convention against Transnational Organised Crime when he said that whilst the criminals may be powerful, representing entrenched interests and the clout of a global enterprise worth billions of dollars, they're not invincible. That won't be true. One-off interventions do not disrupt serious organised criminal operations. These criminal groups can only be weakened through targeted, sustained and continuous intervention activity. Tools outside of the traditional law enforcement arena, such as the administrative powers of government departments, public authorities and the private sector, must be deployed. Partnership working with the regulators of trade and industry enable an attack to be made upon those who work in the background and create a framework of apparent legitimacy for organised criminals. And this includes accountants and lawyers. Had to get lawyers in again, you notice that. Governments themselves are not outside of this challenge. I've seen corruption at such high levels in governments of nations that indigenous law enforcement is paralysed from operating effectively, and outside law enforcement assistance is reluctant to become too closely involved in what is clearly corrupt and improper state conduct. So what then? Do we simply shrug our shoulders and walk away? It's tempting, but we cannot and must not. Or one thing that can be guaranteed is that you have now created that safe haven that serious organised criminals will exploit for the future. But as law enforcement officers, we are severely limited in those situations. This level of governmental corruption and unacceptable conduct must be tackled at a higher level by a global challenge led by international government action. It's not something that should occur in a piecemeal fashion, but be properly and strategically targeted as part of national security strategies. Although termed national, they have to be internationally focused if they're to be successful. Law enforcement does then have a major role to play in the development of the rule of law and the establishment of a law enforcement infrastructure in partnership with prosecutors, the military and governments. This is the activity that I am proud to have been part of with what's going on in Afghanistan, for example, and which I hope to see replicated in Africa for the future. Okay, well, if you're still with me, I expect you'll be wondering whether I'm actually advocating the abandonment of law enforcement to a regime based upon legislation and prohibition enforced by government agencies around the world in some massive bureaucracy. The answer to that is no. But in some cases, yes. Effective investigative capability of a very high order will continue to be absolutely necessary, but ensuring that other parts of the state are doing their bit will significantly enhance the outcomes desired. Networked criminal intelligence at a strategic as well as tactical level is essential. Too often law enforcement intelligence has been limited to the tactical only, or which door do I kick in to find the drugs? There has to be strategic intelligence that informs national and international threat assessments. Now, many countries represented here today produce their own national threat assessments, which they share with each other on a voluntary basis. But where's the global approach, or even a regional approach, necessary for coalitions of governments to act in concert? Law enforcement has to be technologically equipped and informed about the threats it faces. For example, many countries are so far behind in relation to combating cybercrime, yet all nod sagely and agree this is a major issue for today and the near future. The counter-terrorism agencies are also very aware and are engaged in meeting the challenge from cyber terrorists, but there are so many overlapping methodologies employed by criminals and terrorists in the use of the cyber world that beg for joined-up action. A national security strategy would bring that together. It's also vital that law enforcement is fighting the battle of today and not yesterday. I said earlier that new technology will enable new ways of doing things, but also some newer forms of crime or their manifestation would cause many to think that they should be addressed rather than others. In a democracy, it cannot be right that the law enforcers themselves decide where they will focus their efforts. A strategic approach must be applied to determine where effort is applied. How it's done is clearly a matter for law enforcement to apply itself to and come up with the most effective and efficient way to achieve against the strategic goals set. I want to come back to that in a moment when I talk about performance measurement. But let's consider an example regarding where strategically we should focus international and national effort. And here I'm going to be deliberately provocative to wake you all up. Do we want to focus upon trafficking of cocaine from South America to the West, where overprotected and rich idiots stick it up their noses? The cost to their health is often individually colossal, but on the global scale, what does it matter? I'm not necessarily advocating such a change before you think I finally lost the plot. In the UK, the strategy of large-scale interdiction and working with the US and Colombian authorities, as well as our Spanish and other European colleagues, has led to serious organised crime having to bulk out what cocaine they can get, to such an extent that its value has fallen through the floor. But a lot of effort went into that over many years. Compare that to the pathetically small international law enforcement approach to counterfeit pharmaceuticals. In parts of Africa and other poor countries, counterfeit drugs for HIV, TB and other common but deadly ailments are being sold to aid agencies and governments who are unable to spot the difference from the original and genuine product until it's too late, of course. The value of this disgusting trade is phenomenal in economic terms, but what of the suffering it causes? It needs an international strategic view to be taken, because the suppliers of these counterfeit pharmaceuticals are not invisible in the world. Often they're the same ostensibly legitimate businessmen I spoke of before. They have the resources and the manufacturing capability to produce counterfeit goods of high quality, if I can call them that, to deceive those who buy them to treat the sick.